proposition, ideas, and theories. We'll first talk about the subsystems of language. We can have two definite categories with these. We have the building blocks, which is phonology, morphology, and syntax. And then we have the other four: semantics, pragmatics, functions, and registers. And these are the subsystems of communication and language in use. So when we talk about phonology, phonology is the sound system of a language. And we have the big ideas within phonology is the idea of a phoneme. That's the sound that affects meaning. English, we have consonants and vowels. Spelling does not always equal a phoneme. Remember, like a letter C can sound like K or S. Not all languages have the same set of phonemes. The second big idea within the subsystem of phonemes is that of a minimal pair. A minimal consonants can create minimal pairs like the big and fig or fig and dig, but vowels can also create minimal pairs, wish and wash, etc. The last big idea we'll talk about for phonology are the aspects. Aspects are the way we describe the features of a manner. So p is bilabial because it's both lips, nasal, and voiced. The next subsystem is morphology, and that's the word system of a language. A morpheme is a unit of meaning: stems, roots, prefixes, and suffixes. We also have bound and free morphemes. So a free morpheme can stand by itself, like the word artichoke. A bound morpheme, on the other hand, does carry meaning, but it can't stand by itself. It's bound to other morphemes. The ed past tense marker is a morpheme, but it can't be by itself. Prefixes work similarly. Now, with word form, morphemes can change parts of speech, like the NE can alter the meaning. So, for example, we have happy and we put un in front of it. It's altered the meaning as in not happy, but the base is still talking about this idea of happy. Syntax is the next subsystem we'll talk about. Syntax is the arrangement of phrases, clauses. The big ideas for syntax is word order matters. That SVO stands for subject, verb, object, which is what English is. Don't forget that adjectives and adverbs have certain orders, certain places that they have to be in a sentence. We have combinations of words. Phrases are two or more words, and they can be a noun phrase, prepositional, verb phrase. We also have clauses, and we have two kinds of clauses. An independent clause is a sentence. It can stand by itself. A dependent clause, on the other hand, has to have other things with it to be complete. Our favorite subtopic, grammar rules. Yes, I know. Remember that subject is the actor in a sentence. The predicate is the verb and things talking about the subject. We have different verb tenses. Prepositional phrase have a certain structure, just like nouns and noun phrases have a certain structure. Our last topic for syntax is types of simple sentences, one subject, one verb, of compound sentences, which are two simple sentences joined with that conjunction. To be complex, you have to add a dependent clause. Semantics. What do words mean? Lexicon. Lexicon is the vocabulary of a language. Words can have exact meaning or be an implied meaning. Remember these labels of a denotation and a connotation. Denotation, That's the exact direct meaning. A connotation, on the other hand, has emotional weight with that word. Often connotations are culturally based. Slender has a positive connotation, gaunt has a negative one. And then there's the topic of idioms. Idioms are culturally based expressions that don't mean exactly what they say. For example, if I told you that the car I bought was a lemon, you would understand that it was a car that had a lot of trouble, didn't work, not that it was a piece of fruit. Of course, these present problems for students. I've included here a link to idiomsite.com, which is a nice list of common idioms that we use almost. So we have the idea of academic and social language. They're two separate entities. So we have fluency in both, BICS, which is the social language, and CALP, which is academic language. Remember that the ability in either one does not predict ability in the other one. After that, we go to functions of language. Besides reporting, telling facts, or telling a story, we also use language to get things done, apologize, offer advice. We learn how to interrupt, many different things. Registers can be thought of as a level of formality. So in other words, everybody's favorite topic, grammar terms. I included this Quizlet link to refresh and remember the grammar terms. So what's a reflexive pronoun and all of that stuff. We need to only focus on these 7. Languages have cross-linguistic relationships. When I'm talking about this, I'm talking about the idea of things done in first language will help build second language as 2 arenas. One is in language literacy. In other words, if you're literate in your first language, you know that print carries meaning, you know that there's a system to writing and to reading. In a first language, you'll be able to carry that foundational knowledge to the rules of a second language. In addition, this applies to academics as well. If your new 4th grader has already done simple machines in their first language at home, having that background knowledge is very positive and will help with the language development because the concepts are already there, just not in English. Recognizing student errors. We identify errors of our students to help guide language instruction because we want to grow their language proficiency. The Texas exam has questions where they'll provide you an example of a student's writing or something that an ELL student said, and the question will be asking for what kind of language error is there, or what would you do if you had a student who presented language like this. To language acquisition and review. In this section, we'll talk about communication, language, and use. There are 2 big ideas as far as language learning goes. One is acquisition. This is that subconscious process of internalizing linguistic competence. Language learning, on the other hand, is explicit. It's a process that students go through to become aware of the rules in L2. While we focus on language learning a lot, we also have to provide opportunities for acquisition in a low anxiety setting. Some important terms to review in the overall idea of language acquisition. Language interference, that's when we have a student applying the rules that they knew for L1 and they're applying it to L2. interlanguage is features that are the same between languages. Code switching is the phenomena that happens where you are talking along in your second language and you can't remember the word for computer, but you know it in your first language, and you grab that and put it in there to continue with your communication and not to interrupt the flow of thought and conversation. Cognates are two words that have similar spelling and or pronunciation and meaning between language. A standard dialect is the variety of speech that reflects the language of the group in power. Now let's move on to highlight the theories of first language acquisition. We have behaviorism, which is Skinner. Language is learned through imitation, kind of a stimulus and response situation. Chomsky talks about nativism, and that's the idea that all humans are born with a language acquisition device, this LAD. We have the ability to communicate. We have a need even. Can check. Blind people use Braille, deaf people use sign language. It doesn't necessarily have to be standard language like we think of it. And then Bruner has the social interactionist theory, and he talks about language developing through social interaction. Another important person in the second language acquisition is Krashen. Krashen talked about the difference between acquisition and learning, and that they really are two separate processes. He also talks about the natural order hypothesis. This hypothesis is about language being acquired in an order, sequentially, but it doesn't necessarily have a set time frame. Krashen's monitor hypothesis talks about learned language can monitor output. What that means is you can be talking or writing, make an error, and notice that error and correct it. The input hypothesis, I+1, is where you have to start with your knowledge, which is I, and +1 is new knowledge. So it can't be all new knowledge. You have to have a basis for adding new knowledge. The affective filter hypothesis. Language learners, their success is influenced by other things besides the things we've talked about so far. In other words, fear, embarrassment, these kinds of emotions will have an effect on success for a language learner. We talk about this in terms of the filter being up. When the filter is up, that means it's blocking. It's between the language and the language learner's success. Affective aspects include anxiety. High anxiety raises that affective filter and interferes with learning. Some teaching tips for working with that: make sure you have a safe, risk-taking environment and it's free from ridicule. Self-image is also an aspect of affective learning. Positive self-image lowers the affective filter and facilitates learning. Non-direct correction and noticing of successes help with a positive self-interest. Self-image. Interest, there we go, and motivation. If lessons are culturally relevant, classroom atmosphere is relaxed, it's interesting, that filter will go down. inclusive of cultures and language, an easy, familiar place to learn.